Imagine a monster so terrifying that the only way to show it was to hide it. Imagine you're 10 years old, it's midnight, the house is dead quiet, and the only light in the room is the soft blue glow coming from a small CRT television. You're sitting on the floor, controller in hand, staring at a screen that's mostly just darkness. Because of the tech at the time, the original PlayStation couldn't show you everything. It had to hide things in the shadows, and in the darkness, your mind started to do something dangerous. It started to fill in the blanks. That flickering shape in the corner of a hallway in your favourite survival horror game, your brain turns it into something much worse than a few dozen pixels. Now fast forward to 2026, we have achieved what developers in the 90s could only dream of. We have path tracing, 8K textures and character models that look so real you can see the sweat on the foreheads. But here's the thing, despite all that power, a lot of modern horror feels safe. It's beautiful, yeah, but it's clinical. When you can see every detail of a monster, it stops being a nightmare and just becomes a 3D asset. The mystery is gone. I've been thinking about this a lot while working through the index. We often talk about PS1 graphics as dated or janky, but I think we've been looking at it the wrong way. The technical limitations of the 32-bit era weren't just hurdles for the developers to jump over, they were actually the secret ingredients for the most effective horror ever made. The way the textures warped, the way the wobbly polygons made the world feel unstable, and the way the low resolution forced you to squint. It created a specific kind of tension that modern perfection simply cannot replicate. I call this the horror of the unseen. It's the idea that horror is at its best when it's incomplete. It's about the human residue. That feeling that the machine is struggling to show you something it shouldn't be showing you. Today I want to step away from the usual grind of 1,278 games in the index to do something different. We're going to perform a deep dive protocol into the psychology of the lo-fi wear. We're going to look at why the wobbly wall is scarier than the ray trace one, why tank controls were actually a stroke of genius, and why the most terrifying games of 2026 are actually the ones that look like they were made in 1997. Because sometimes, the more the game shows you, the less you actually see. Welcome to the horror of the unseen. I'm Parasine. Now if you're new here, usually you'd find me deep in the trenches of the PSX Index, the project where I'm playing and documenting all 1,278 games released for the original PlayStation in North America. But today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're stepping back to look at the architecture of fear. We're living in a strange time for gaming. It's 2026 and we've essentially won the war on graphics. We have path tracing that mimics real lighting perfectly and engines that can render billions of triangles without breaking a sweat. If you want to see a monster's individual teeth, you can, or the way its skin reacts to the cold, you can, but as the resolution goes up, the tension often goes down. I call this the modern Mirage. The problem with perfect graphics in horror is that they leave absolutely nothing to the imagination. When a game shows you everything in 8K, your brain stops being a participant and starts being just a spectator. There's no mystery left to solve. You're not wondering what's hiding in the corner. You can see exactly what it is, and suddenly, it's just a bunch of high-end digital art. It's not a threat anymore, it's just an asset. Think about the way a modern horror game handles a dark hallway. It's physically accurate, sure. The shadows cast perfectly, but on the PS1, a dark hallway wasn't just dark. It was a technical mess. You had Vertex jitter, where the walls seemed to vibrate. You had texture warping, where the floor looked like it was liquid. Back in 1997, we called that hardware limitations. But in 2026, we're starting to realise these mistakes were actually the secret sauce. Those glitches made the environment feel alive, or like the machine itself was struggling to process the nightmare it was showing you. It created an uncanny valley that modern tech is actually too clean to reach. Today developers are starting to notice we're seeing a massive wave of new indie games that are deliberately throwing away 4K textures to go back to that low poly, wobbly PS1 style. They realise that horror doesn't need more pixels, it needs more shadows. So let's go back to where it all started. Let's look at the technical faults that turned a great plastic box into the greatest horror engine ever built. If you've ever gone back and played a PS1 game on a modern big screen TV, you've seen it. You're standing still, looking at a wall or a floor, and the textures look like they're crawling. The corners of the room don't stay still, they snap and pop as you move the camera. In the tech world, it's called Vertex jitter, and I find texture mapping, but to a 10-year-old kid in a dark room, it just looked like the world was vibrating. You see, the PS1 didn't have something called a floating viewpoint. Without getting too bogged down by the math, it basically means the console couldn't handle decimals. It could only place objects in whole numbers. So as you moved, the game had to constantly round the position of every 3D point to the nearest whole number. This caused the polygons to constantly snap into place, creating that famous wobbly, jittery effect. On paper, that sounds like a hardware flaw. It's a mistake, but in the context of a horror game like Silent Hill or Resident Evil, it was a masterpiece of accidental atmosphere. Think about what that does to your brain. In a modern game, the walls are solid, they feel like concrete, but on the PS1, the walls feel like they were made of liquid. Everything is shifting. It creates this subconscious feeling that the world you're standing in is unstable, that it might break apart any second. It's a visual separation of a mental breakdown. Then you have the textures. Because the PS1 didn't understand perspective correctly, textures would warp and stretch depending on the angle you looked at them. If you walked down a long hallway, the floor would swim beneath your feet. In 2026, we spent billions of dollars trying to make games feel solid and real, but horror isn't about feeling safe or grounded, it's about feeling like you're losing your grip on reality. That jitter did the work for the developers. It made the environment feel hostile, like the very fabric of the game world was rejecting your presence. When you combine that instability with the low resolution, your eyes are constantly trying to fix what you're seeing. You're looking at a jittering pile of brown and grey pixels, and your brain is working overtime to turn that into a monster. The hardware wasn't just showing you a scary story, it was forcing your mind to collaborate in the haunting, and that is something a perfect 8K image can never do. If the jittery polygons were the feeling of the PS1, then the fixed camera angles were the eyes. In 2026, we take total camera control for granted. You use the right stick, you look where you want, and the game follows you like a loyal shadow. But in the 90s, survival horror did something that felt almost insulting to the player. It took your eyes away. It told you exactly where you were allowed to look, and more importantly, exactly what you were allowed to see. Now on the surface, this was a technical trick. The PS1 couldn't render a full 3D world with that much detail, so the developers cheated. They used pre-rendered backgrounds or focused the engine on just a few objects at once. Because the camera wasn't moving, the machine could put more power into making those specific scenes look terrifying. But here's where the genius of intentional friction comes in. Because the developers at Team Silent and Capcom knew exactly where your eyes would be, they could direct the game like a horror movie. Think about the opening alleyway in the original Silent Hill. As Harry Mason follows his daughter into the dark, the camera starts doing things that no sane game camera angle should do. It tilts to the side, it swings up to a high bird's eye view, and then it drops down to the pavement, looking at you from the gutters. You aren't just playing a game anymore, you're the subject of a nightmare. You can hear something, a metallic scraping, a distant siren, but because the camera is fixed, you can't look up at the rooftops. You can't turn around and check the corner. You just have to keep walking in the dark, knowing that something is there, but unable to prove it until it's already on top of you. This is the fear of the unknown in its purest form. In a modern game with the over-the-shoulder camera, you'd just flick the stick, see the monster, and the tension would pop like a balloon. But on the PS1, the tension stays under high pressure because you are visually blindfolded by the director. Every time the camera cuts to a new angle as you cross a room, there's a split second of panic. Did I just walk into a trap? Is there something standing just 1 inch outside the frame? By taking away our control, the PS1 forced us to rely on our other senses. We started listening for footsteps. We started watching for subtle shifts in the grain of the screen. It turned the act of walking down a hallway into a high-stakes gamble. In the 90s, we complained that we couldn't see. In 2026, we're finally realising that not being able to see was the whole point. If the fixed camera was a blindfold, then the atmosphere of this era was a thick, heavy blanket thrown over the entire world. In the late 90s, the hardware was constantly struggling. It was a powerful little machine for its time, but it had a very short draw distance. Basically, it could only render things that were a few feet in front of the player. Anything further away would just pop into existence, which looks terrible and completely breaks the immersion. Most developers tried to hide this with the void, a deep, thick, pitch-black darkness that swallowed everything at the edge of the frame. But the real genius of this era came when the developers decided to lean into that limitation and turn it into a weather effect. They covered their worlds in a thick, grey supernatural fog. On a technical level, this was just a way to stop the game from crashing. It meant the hardware only had to worry about rendering the sidewalk directly under your feet. But on an emotional level, it changed everything. It transformed a simple hardware limit into an exercise in pure isolation. When you're walking through these environments, you can only see about 5 feet in front of you. You know there's a world out there, but you're trapped in a tiny bubble of visibility. It creates a feeling of environmental claustrophobia. Even though you're technically standing in an open street, you feel like you're in a coffin. And this is where that human residue really shines. Because the graphics were low resolution, the fog wasn't a clean, smooth smoke effect. It was grainy, it was noisy, it looked like static on an old television. This made the air itself feel dirty, like you were breathing in something toxic. In a modern horror game, fog is usually just a beautiful visual effect. It's pretty, but it's not scary. But in the 32-bit era, that fog was scary because it felt like a wall. It was a physical barrier between you and safety. Because you couldn't see what was coming, the games of this era forced you to rely on sound. You'd hear a metallic scrape or a distant groan, and your brain would go into overdrive. You'd start seeing shapes where there wasn't any. You'd start questioning every shadow. The technical cheat of the fog ended up creating a psychological masterpiece because it forced you to supply the horror yourself. The fog didn't just hide the graphics, it hid the exit. It made sure that no matter where you went, you were always alone. This brings us to a really interesting turning point. For years, the industry's goal was to get rid of the jank. We wanted to kill the fog, fix the jittery walls, and give the player total control of the camera. And for a while, we thought we'd won, but lately there's been a shift. In modern games, we're seeing a massive wave of new indie developers who are doing something that would have seemed insane 20 years ago. They are deliberately bringing the jank back. They are throwing away the 8K textures and the perfect lighting to embrace the wobbly polygons and the grainy fog of the 32-bit era. Why? Because they realise that perfection isn't scary. These modern lo-fi horror games understand that there is a specific kind of dread that comes only from a low-resolution world. When a game looks perfect, it feels finished. It's a closed book. But when a game uses that PS1 style aesthetic, it feels unstable. It feels like something that shouldn't exist. Like a cursed tape you found in an attic. By rejecting the modern Mirage, these developers were tapping back into the horror of the unseen. They're using the same tricks we've talked about. The fixed cameras that hide the corners, the jittering walls that make the environments feel alive, and the heavy atmosphere that limits your vision. They aren't just doing it for nostalgia either. These games are hitting a nerve because they offer something that AAA horror has lost. A sense of mystery. They've realised that your imagination is a much more powerful engine than any graphics card. They've learned that the most terrifying thing they can show a player is almost nothing. It's a reminder that art isn't about how many pixels you can cram onto the screen, it's about how much space you leave for the person playing. These modern indies have proven that the limitations of the 90s weren't a cage, they were a toolkit. And as we continue through the index, we're going to see those tools being used in ways that still manage to get under your skin nearly 30 years later. While we spend a lot of time talking about the look of this era, we often overlook the way it sounds. Games today have orchestral scores and spatial audio that can pinpoint a sound to within a fraction of an inch. But back in the 90s, the PlayStation had a very specific, almost metallic sound signature that added a layer of dread you just can't get from high definition recording. The PS1's audio chip had a limited amount of memory. To make everything fit, sound effects and music often had to be compressed. This resulted in a slight hiss or a tinny hollow quality to the audio. In a bright, colourful platformer, you might not even notice it, but in an atmospheric horror game, that hollowness feels like isolation. Think about the sound of your footsteps echoing in a silent hallway. On a modern console, that footstep sounds like a real boot hitting a real world, but on the PS1, it sounds like a ghost of a footstep. It's a bit thin, a bit sharp, and it echoes in a way that feels unnatural. It creates this sensation that you are walking through a world that is dead, or at least a world that isn't quite right. Then there's the music. Because developers couldn't always fit full sweeping tracks on the disc, they often use short looping industrial hums or low frequency drones. It wasn't music in the traditional sense. It was more like environmental noise. It was the sound of a machine breathing. When you combine that compressed audio with the physical sound of the console itself, the rhythmic spinning of the disc and the faint whir of the fan, the experience becomes incredibly tactile. You aren't just hearing the game, you're hearing the hardware struggle to keep up with the nightmare running. Modern games try to make audio disappear into the background to make things feel seamless, but horror thrives on things that stand out. That specific PS1 reverb, which made every room feel like a cold, empty basement, did more to build the atmosphere than 100 pieces of orchestra ever could. It's what I call the audio ghost. It's the sound of technology itself haunting the experience. It's the slight bit of static, that metallic edge to a scream, and that oppressive silence that feels like it's actually pressing against your ears. Even now, when I hear a specific 32-bit reverb, it triggers a fight or flight response. It reminds me that in this era, the silence was just as dangerous as the monsters. If the camera angle was the eyes and the fog was the atmosphere, then the controls were the body. And in this era, the body was heavy. In 2026, we talk about tank controls like they were a mistake, a relic of time before we figured out how to use 2 analog sticks. But if you look at them through the architectural lens, you realise they were a deliberate choice to create vulnerability. Think about how most modern horror games feel. Your character is agile, you can sprint, you can mantle over walls, and you can turn on a dime to face the threat. You feel like an athlete, but in the 90s, your character moved like a tank. You had to press up to move forward, regardless of where the camera was pointing. To turn, you had to slowly pivot on the spot. On paper, it sounds clunky, it sounds like bad design, but in a horror context, it was a masterpiece of mechanical dread. The goal of horror isn't to make you feel powerful, it's to make you feel helpless. By making the controls heavy, the developers force you to commit to every single movement. If you walked into a room and saw something moving in the corner, you couldn't just flick a stick and run away. You had to stop, pivot, and accelerate. That split second of clunkiness is where the panic lives. It changed the way we interacted with the space. Because turning was slow, the layout of the room became a puzzle. You'd look at the narrow hallway and think, if something comes at me from the front, do I have enough space to turn around and get out? It made the environment itself feel like a trap. In modern games, we try to remove all the friction from the game. We want everything to feel smooth and responsive. But when you remove friction from horror, you remove the fear. You can easily escape. There is no stakes. The tank controls force you to be deliberate. They made you feel like a real person, someone who was scared, clumsy, and struggling to move under the weight of the sheer terror. We weren't a superhuman. We were just a person in a bad situation, trying to get a heavy, uncooperative body to move towards the exit. Looking back, these controls weren't a limitation of the hardware. They were a limitation placed on us. They were designed to make sure that no matter how fast your brain wanted to run, your character was always just a few seconds behind. It's that gap, that tiny delay between your panic and your movement, where the real horror of the PS1 era truly lived. Today we don't really have cutscenes anymore, at least not in the way we used to. In a modern game, the transition from playing to watching is seamless. The character you're controlling looks exactly the same during a conversation as they do during a fight, but in the 90s, every big story beat came with a massive clunk. I'm talking about FMV, full motion videos. Because the PlayStation couldn't render high detail faces or cinematic lighting in real time, the developers would pre-record these big, high budget movies and put them on the disc. As a kid, these were your reward for finishing a level. The screen would go black, and you'd hear the disc spin up, and suddenly, the blocky, jittery character you'd been playing as was replaced by a smooth, realistic version of themselves. But here's the thing, that jump was incredibly jarring. There was this massive visual disconnect between the world you were interacting with and the world the movie was showing you. 1 second, you're looking at a pile of brown triangles that you think is a monster, and the next, you're seeing a pre-rendered nightmare with wet skin and blinking eyes. This creates a very specific kind of uncanny valley. Because the tech wasn't quite as movie quality yet, the people in these FMVs often moved in a way that felt stiff and robotic. Their skin looked like plastic and their eyes felt hollow. Instead of making the game feel more real, it made them feel more surreal. It was like the game was showing you a memory of what it wanted to be, but it couldn't quite get the details right. And because these movies were a different resolution and could use different lighting than the actual gameplay, they felt like they belonged in a different world entirely. It added to that feeling of human residue, the sense that you were looking at something off, something that was struggling to replicate reality, but failing in a way that felt deeply uncomfortable. Modern games strive for consistency. We want the immersion to never break, but old games on the PlayStation 1, that break was the horror. That moment when the game stopped being a pile of pixels and tried to show you a real face was often the most unsettling part of the whole experience. It was a reminder that you weren't just playing a game, you were interacting with a machine that had its own very strange idea of what a human looked like. Up until now, we've been talking about what's happening inside the television, but in the 90s, the horror didn't stop at the screen, it bled out into our living room. There's a tactical physical side of this era where we've completely lost in the age of digital downloads and silent solid state consoles. I call it human residue. It's the feeling that you aren't just playing a piece of software, you're interacting with a physical object that is struggling, breathing and occasionally dying right in front of you. Think about the sound of a PlayStation 1 in a quiet room at 2 AM. Modern consoles are whisper quiet, but the PS1 was a mechanical beast. You could hear the high-pitched whine of the disc spinning 1,000 rhythms per second. You could hear the clunk clunk of the laser assembly moving back and forth as it searched for the next room's data. When you entered a new area and the screen went black, the mechanical struggle was the only thing you could hear. It made the machine feel alive, like it was a co-conspirator in the horror. Then there was the memory card. These days, your progress is saved automatically to an invisible cloud, but back then, your life was stored in a tiny plastic square. I remember sitting in the dark, watching the red LED in front of the console blink while the game saved. There was always this low-level anxiety that the power would just go out and you'd lose all your progress. All your survival would just vanish into the format error. That fear of losing your progress mirrored the fear of the game itself. The stakes felt physical. Even the way we handled the games felt different. You'd pick up a heavy, cracked dual case, pull out the black bottom disc, and see the scratches of 100 previous sessions. It felt like handling an artifact. In a modern 8K world, everything is clean, everything is sanitised, but in the 32-bit era was dirty. The hardware had personality, it had flaws, it had a heartbeat. When you played a horror game in the 90s, you weren't just a spectator, you were part of a circuit. Between the flickering CRT screen, the vibrating controller, and the mechanical grind of the disk drive, the game felt less like a product and more like an experience that was physically happening to you. That human residue, that feeling of a machine pushing itself to its absolute limit to scare you, is the one thing that no amount of processing power can ever truly replace. It's easy to look back at the 32 era as just a stepping stone, a necessary, wobbly bridge we had to cross to get to the photorealism we have today. But if that were true, the lo-fi look would have died out years ago. Instead, in 2026, it's undergoing a massive resurgence. We are seeing a new generation of developers who weren't even alive when the PlayStation launched, and yeah, they are choosing to make games that look exactly like they came out of the 1997 bargain bin. This isn't just about nostalgia, it's a realisation that the architecture of fear we've been talking about, the jitter, the fog, the oppressive silence, is actually a timeless design language. These developers have realised that when you lower the resolution, you raise the immersion. By giving the player less to look at, you give them more to think about. Today, high fidelity horror has a ceiling. Once you've seen a monster in 8K, you've seen it. There's no more room for it to grow in your mind. But lo-fi horror has no ceiling. Because the graphics are abstract, your brain continues to evolve the horror every time you play. That pixelated shape in the corner stays scary because it can be whatever your deepest fears need it to be. This is the future of the genre. As AAA games become more expensive and more perfect, they become more predictable. But the indie scene is proving that you can create a viral masterpiece with a handful of polygons and a heavy dose of atmosphere. They are finding the human residue in the glitches. They are using it to build worlds that feel more dangerous than any big budget blockbuster. We've come to a point where old doesn't mean obsolete, it means refined. The PS1 didn't just give us a library of games, it gave us a blueprint for how to use technology to mess with the human psyche. It taught us that a machine doesn't need to be powerful to be terrifying, it just needs to know how to have the truth. As we look forward to the next decade of horror, I suspect we'll see a lot more wobbly walls and grainy fog, because as it turns out, the most advanced graphics engine in the world is still the 3 pounds of grey matter sitting inside your skull, and the original PlayStation was the first console that truly learned how to hack it. So where does this leave us? We started this look into the dark because I wanted to understand why, after playing through so much of the index, these specific 32-bit nightmares still carry so much weight. In 2026, it's easy to dismiss this error as primitive, but I think we've proven that primitive is exactly why it works. The wobbly textures, the suffocating fog, and the heavy tank-like movements weren't just the limitations of the grey plastic box. They were the building blocks of a specific kind of dread, a dread that relies on the unseen. They forced us to be active participants in our own scares. They left a human residue on the hardware that modern perfection just can't seem to replicate. Whether it was a technical cheat to hide the sure draw distance or a design choice to make us feel vulnerable, the PlayStation era understood something fundamental. Horror is a collaboration. It's a conversation between a machine that's struggling to show you reality and a brain that's all too willing to believe the worst. I hope this protocol into the architecture of fear has given you a bit of a different perspective the next time you see a jittering wall or a grainy cutscene. These aren't just old games, they are masterclasses in how to use every single limitation to get under someone's skin. But for now, it's time to step back into the light. The deep dive into the horror of the unseen is officially complete, but our mission with the PSX Index is far from over. There are still hundreds of worlds left to document, from the bright and the colourful to the weird and the broken. Some of them will be masterpieces, and some of them will be absolute jank, but every single one of them has a story to tell about how we got where we are today. I'll be heading back into the trenches for the next standard index entry very soon, where we'll get back into the grind of documenting every single North American release. There's a lot of history left to uncover. Until next time, keep your memory card safe and your eyes on the shadows. I'm Parasan, and I'll see you on the next entry.
Let me tell you what bugs me about human endeavour. I've never been the human in question. Have you? Mankind went to the moon. I don't even know where Grimsby is. Forget progress by proxy. Land on your own moon. It's no longer about what they can achieve out there in your behalf, but what we can experience up here in our own time. It's called mental wealth.